Sounds good. Hello friends, hello TBI, Sisterhood. It's Bruce Kreitzberg, another TBI member, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on some pruning basics today. If I have to cough, forgive me. I've got my videographer safely masked up here, so she'll be all right. So I don't want to go too deep into anything on pruning today, but just give you a little bit of basics to help you with any of the pruning that you have to do in your garden. Phyllis Bobrow is nice enough to let us use her garden to do a little bit of demonstration, and I won't really do a lot of pruning today. I mostly want to tell and a little bit of demo, but not actually full-on pruning because I don't know how long your attention span is. So before I start, I just want to define a few terms that might be useful. Perennial means that a perennial plant is a plant that goes through its life cycle in more than 1 year. So you're probably familiar with putting seeds in the ground, for example for tomatoes or for some flowers, and seeing them germinate, grow, flower, and die all in the same year. That's an annual. Some plants do the same thing in 2 years. That's biennial. If a plant does it has a life cycle that takes longer than that before it dies, then we call it perennial. So pretty much all the trees that we know of, all the woody shrubs, and many smaller plants are perennials, and that's what we'll mostly be looking at today is pruning perennials, particularly woody perennials. And that's the next term I want to define is woody versus herbaceous. So woody is fairly obvious. Plants that produce a structure that becomes woody that you couldn't, for example, just cut with a paper scissors easily like you could something else that is herbaceous. Here's an herbaceous plant. This is bear's breech or Acanthus mollis, and if you had a paper scissor here, you could easily cut through it. It stays. This particular perennial is evergreen, so it stays green all of the time, but it has soft tissue compared to woody tissue. Okay, and then I also want to define and maybe demonstrate two basic kinds of pruning cuts. This is the most basic place to start, but it's actually very helpful if you think about pruning with just these two variations. One is heading cuts and one is thinning cuts. So to demonstrate first with my fingers, if these were the twigs or the branches of a woody plant and I wanted to make heading cuts, I could cut them all right down the middle or any place on their stems to just head them off. Now my plant is smaller or shorter. If instead of doing it that way, I wanted to prune to thin it out, I could remove an entire stem or two entire stems, and now I've thinned out this plant. To demonstrate it, I've got a branch from Phyllis's plum tree here, I think, and a simple heading cut would be, for example, to take this twig. We're going to pretend this is a tree or a shrub, all right? Take any stem and simply head it off. I could do that, and a lot of people are familiar with that kind of pruning, for example, from pruning a hedge or taking a two-handed shear to any plant that they simply want to grow in an undirected way. So that's a heading cut. If you want to do a thinning cut instead, if I decided that this part of the plant was too busy, for example, I could remove whole stems. I could pretend this part is too busy and remove a whole stem back from its origin, okay? So that is thinning for you. And another basic idea or basic concept I want to tell you about is how to direct the growth of a plant. This is a great trick to know, and some of you might already know it intuitively, others perhaps not. It's called apical dominance. Apical is just from the word apex, like the end point or the termination of something, the height of something. So apical dominance refers to the fact that on any plant, on any branch, the bud that is the farthest out is what gets the dominant amount of hormones and resources. I sometimes explain it to people as being analogous to to sibling birth order in a large family. How the oldest kid is always in charge. It's kind of like that with the buds on a branch or a stem. So if you know that basic principle, then what you can do is you can cut back to a bud on one side or another of a branch or stem, and then expect the growth to mostly go in that direction. So again, if we use this prop and let it stand in for a tree branch or a shrub branch, let's pretend that I want growth to go in this direction. Then I cut back to that direction, and this is where most of the growth on this stem is now going to go. But if instead I want it to grow this way, I can cut back to here, and now it's going to go that way. And the same is true even getting down to the smaller scale, down to the bud. So on this little twig, if I wanted growth to go this way, I'd cut back to that bud. And if I wanted growth to go that way, I could cut back to this bud. So by knowing that basic principle of apical dominance, you can direct the growth of woody plants very easily, okay? So that's some of the basics to get started. What I think I'll do next, thanks Phyllis. What I think I'll do next is just talk a little bit about a few of the plants in Phyllis's garden here. Forgive me while I move around the garden just a little bit and put away some of my props to move on to the next part of it. So I'm standing in front of a woody shrub called Abelia, kind of like the biblical Abel, Cain and Abel. This is Abelia Grandiflora, and I don't think there's an English name for it that I'm aware of. But anyway, this is a really nice sort of semi-evergreen woody shrub, and the way it's been pruned or not pruned in this garden is actually, I think, a lucky or a wise start on this that's happened in Phyllis's garden. What I mean by that is it hasn't been headed off, and that's another basic. Pardon me, I'm going to grab my cheat sheet here. That's another basic principle that I wanted to share about pruning woody ornamentals in general, is the difference between heading and thinning and the results that you get in the garden. A lot of people that don't know a lot about pruning tend to take a two-handed head shear to everything, which is okay sometimes, and if you want to keep it simple, it keeps it simple, at least in terms of how many tools you have to keep around. But it doesn't allow for a lot of interest and variety, in my opinion. There are many hundreds and thousands of plants that you can grow in the mild climate of Western Oregon. And knowing something about the plant and the natural shapes that they tend to take can make for a much more interesting garden, because you can enhance or accentuate their natural tendencies. And a lot of shrubs, a lot of woody shrubs do have a tendency to do what this Abelia is doing. If you take a step back and show the form of this, what it has is what we usually call an arching or a fountain type shape. It sort of grows from a whole bunch of different canes, I would usually call them. Some people might call them trunks or stems, but I'll usually call them canes, kind of like bamboo canes. And so letting it do that adds a lot of interest to the garden, instead of just chopping everything into, you know, arbitrary geometric shapes, which you sometimes see, unfortunately. I think a little bit too much of people taking a head shear and pruning things into rectangles, circles, spheres, what have you. And again, I don't want to be overly judgmental. People should prune how they want to, and a lot of times people like to juxtapose geometric shapes with natural shapes in the garden. Can be very interesting also. I simply want to say that on the West Coast, the style tends to be more natural, more naturalistic, where people who know how to do so usually want to let the plants have something like the shape that they are inclined towards in the first place. So with that in mind, to prune this Abelia, what I want to recommend is that instead of doing heading cuts on it, that you almost always just do thinning cuts. And for ornamental pruning in general, that's not a bad guideline, is that there should be relatively few times that you're making heading cuts on woody ornamental plants in the first place. If you're growing hedges, if you're trying to grow topiary, those are good times to have out the hedge shear or to be making heading cuts. But almost all the rest of the time, you're making thinning cuts, okay? So that's another little pearl of advice or pearl of wisdom I'll try to pass on to you. So if I was gonna prune this, what I would do is go right down to the base of the plant where these canes are coming out, and I would remove, when I need to, I could remove entire canes by using a lopper like this, or a small saw, for example, a fold-out saw like that. And so you can thin out some of these canes when it seems to be too much, and you can also even shorten it if you know how to do it. And what you would do if you wanted to shorten a plant like this is thin out those canes that are the tallest. So it's sort of like a crown reduction on a tree, except in this case we simply have a shrub. So what you would do is see which canes are the tallest. In this case, most of the canes on this particular Abelia seem to have originated at almost the same time, so there's not a lot of options. But usually when you're maintaining these carefully and forward-thinkingly, if I can coin a phrase, you would remove a few canes each year. Almost never more than a third of the total number of canes. But if you remove a few canes each year, then what you have is canes of different ages, and you have foliage growing at different heights on the plant that add interest to it. And you also have flowering happening at different heights. The way this one has been growing for some time, it's getting taller and taller, and I suspect that almost all of the growth and almost all the flowering is happening up at eye level or even above the head level. So what you'd really want to do is choose a few older or tallest canes each year and remove a few of those carefully, probably with a narrow saw, like I said, close to the ground. And that also is a chance to talk about what's called renewal pruning. And renewal pruning is kind of like the name says, just trying to renew the vitality of the plant by removing some of the oldest parts of it. So if you have a plant, this one's getting kind of close where you're looking at a lot of wood when you look out the window or when you walk by sort of at eye level and below, and you want to green it up. You would want to remove some of those oldest canes to force new canes to come from the bottom, and that will happen. So I'll probably use that term renewal pruning again with a couple of these other plants. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover on this one. I think that will mostly do it for the Abelia Grandiflora. So let's go to the Rhododendron this way. So here is the much loved rhododendron. What would Pacific Northwest gardening be without rhododendrons in the garden, right? Almost every property, almost every garden that I go to has one or two or many rhododendrons. And they are fabulous plants. A lot of the rhododendrons all over North America start their life in Oregon. So with this plant, I think it's important to ask yourself how tall you want it to be and what shape you want it to be. Rhododendrons can live a really long time. They're kind of like trees. In fact, the word rhododendron in Greek means tree rose. Dendron means tree, rhod means rose. So someone back in the ancient times recognized that this is a fabulous, almost tree-like plant that has these incredible showy flowers, as does a rose. And up in Hendricks Park, and in a garden next to Hendricks Park where I work, you can find specimens of this species that are 75, 100 years old and older, and they have enormous, sort of leg size trunks or branches on them, and heights that go up to 20 feet and even taller. So knowing what you want to do with your rhodi is a good idea. Personally, my preference for rhododendrons is to let them become a little bit tree-like. It takes many years. They're not fast-growing plants. They're actually quite slow usually. But choosing the right plant for the right place and knowing how you want to prune it is good to do. What I see most people doing with their rhododendrons is sort of chopping them down, making them more bush-like, which is also fine. I'll sometimes try to differentiate, even though the terms are a little bit arbitrary, between shrubs that are more sort of shrub-like or tree-like with open spaces and windows, or air pockets between them, sort of like a tree has when you look at it in profile, versus ones that are kept compact and tight. And with rhododendrons, you really can grow them either way. Again, I don't want to be overly judgmental and say one way is much better than the other. It's really your garden, and you should prune the plants how you want to live with them. But there is a big difference in what you would do. Let me look at my cheat sheet here for a moment, see if there's anything else I want to do before I show you how you could go about it with this plant. So the basics for getting the shape you want basically have to do with whether you're going to head or whether you're going to thin. So if we wanted this plant, this individual, to become taller and more tree-like, we would start to remove some of the bottom branches off of the trunk. There's often multiple trunks, so you have to sort of consider and coordinate that. But you would start to remove what's close to the ground as it grows up and gets older. And then as it gets up and forms more structure up high, you again would thin it so that you could sort of see through it and open it up so it has an interesting canopy to it. If you wanted to keep it tight and more bush-like, then you would just be making heading cuts any place that you want to see it bush out. So if I sacrifice a small piece here, if you wanted to encourage density for a more bush-like appearance, you would simply be making heading cuts. If you can, it's good to make the cuts, right above or downstream, you might say, of a bud. So finding the buds on this plant, this particular one that I cut is pretty tiny and there's not a lot of buds, but if you look carefully, right at the base of the petiole of this leaf, you can see a vegetative bud right here. So notice that that's a tiny vegetative bud. Here's another one at the base of this leaf right here where I'm pointing with my pruner, compared to these enormous flowering buds that are getting ready to open up this spring. So you could make cuts just above or downstream of a bud if you want it to bush out in that spot, and that's what you would start to see is basically wherever you cut on a woody plant, you're going to start to see growth just behind that or just upstream of where you've cut. So I hope that helps a little bit with knowing how to go about pruning the rhodie. The other thing to know about the rhododendron, and this is true of ornamentals in general, is that it's helpful to know when the plant flowers and when the plant produces its buds. With rhododendrons and azaleas, a lot of people already know, because they're so common here, that you have to choose the moment kind of carefully. It sets up its buds, its flowering buds, for the next year very quickly after it flowers. So if this particular individual is flowering in April, I'm making this up, I don't really know when it's going to flower, but if this one was flowering in April, you really need to approach the plant right after or as it's flowering if you want to do some pruning on it, so that you're not pruning off the next year's flower buds, because it sets those up within a few weeks after flowering. So that's a helpful tip, I hope. Okay, next, let's go to the blueberries. This way. So blueberries, I think, are just fabulous plants for our part of the country in our climate. Not only do you get great fruit from them, but they're really, I think, quite beautiful. This is the second or third day of winter here, and you can see how colorful the newer growth is on this blueberry bush. You also get white flowers in spring or early summer, and of course the blueberries themselves are very pretty before you pick them and eat them. So growing blueberries in Eugene and Springfield is a little bit challenging because our soils here tend to be really clayish. They hold a lot of water, too much water sometimes, and these blueberries grow okay, pretty well in town, but not like they do out at the farms that we see. If you've ever gone blueberry picking at the farms, you know that you get, you know, these huge bushes that are as tall as we are, or even taller, and that's mostly, I think, because they're growing them on really well draining soil. So a lot of the ones we grow in town will not be quite as tall unless you happen to be living in a nice loamy soil like along River Road or something like that. So that's one thing. The key, I think, to pruning these blueberries is knowing some of the same principles as you would use if you were pruning fruit trees, and that is about trying to prune so that you open up the center of the plant like this. My fingers again representing branches or twigs. The idea when you're pruning fruit trees a lot of the time, and blueberries as well, is to let air circulation and sunlight into the plant to help it. So what you're often doing again is making more thinning cuts than heading cuts. On this particular one, you can see it's a little bit crowded. There's a lot here that's overlapping, and if I were pruning this particular plant, I would probably snap and remove some of the growth that's in the center of the plant to try to open it up. That's what I'm doing right now. And I could go about that, you know, just sort of instinctively, but I want to give you another little maybe teaching aid. What I sometimes talk about with these is the 5 Ds. The 5 Ds of pruning with blueberries or fruit trees, and that sort of helps you set priorities. The 5 Ds have to do with what you would remove from the plant. So the Ds stand for dead, dying, diseased, dumb, and redundant, and I'll explain that. Dead and dying are fairly obvious. So here we have a dead twig, and that's certainly one I can thin out. Dying, here's another dead one. Dying is not so perfectly clear, but if it looks like it's on its way out because you see some discoloration or cankering happening, then that's a candidate to remove as well. Diseased, I think it goes along with that. Now the last two, the dumb and the redundant. What we call dumb in pruning is a branch that grows where it shouldn't, or a branch that doesn't know what the program is. In this case, the program is trying to grow outward, like I was saying, and not back towards the center. So this branch right here, which is growing right through the center, this one is dumb, and out it comes. Same with this. This one should go. Bad cut there. But you can take it back a little farther so that you're thinning out whole canes as well. Kind of like I was saying with the Abelia, is that this plant can really respond well to renewal pruning, removing entire canes, maybe 1 or 2. If you have a healthy blueberry bush with a lot of canes, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 good canes on it. It doesn't hurt to remove 1 or 2 canes that maybe are clogging up the center each year. And what that will do is it'll encourage new canes to form at the bottom and thereby renew the plant. So try that. I also want to recommend that people who have blueberries try to keep most of the productive twigs about 5 years old or younger, approximately. A little bit older than that is fine, but they do start to become less productive when they're older than that. So what you can do to renew it is, like I just did, remove entire canes that you're getting new growth starting out. Sometimes you might choose an old cane to remove, or if you do have the good luck to be growing really tall, huge blueberry bushes like we see out at the farms, and it's up at 5 or 6 or 7 feet, you don't have to take those all the way to the ground. You can prune back just below the productive or harvestable part of the plant and remove secondary branches by doing that. So again, I'll demonstrate a little bit here, just sort of cleaning this one up, getting some of these crossing branches out, removing some of the ones that are growing towards the center or through the center. This one is right in the center. This one is older. You can thin that out. And so on and so on. See if there's any more points here to make. So I think I covered that, removing 1 or 2 canes each year. Large versus small, removing crossing, and one's growing towards the center. Oh, and finally, if you want to direct a cane, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the lesson about apical dominance, if you want to direct where things go, then you can do that too. For example, excuse me, if I thought that one of these canes was getting too tall, I can direct the growth outward, away from the center, by cutting back to that stem, so that now most of the growth will be in this direction, okay? So that's how you apply that lesson about the apical dominance. Okay, one more plant. Let's go prune a rose. Okay, so this is the rose I'm interested in talking about. Phyllis actually has dozens of roses on this property. It's got to be a fabulous show come spring or summer, I'm sure. But most of the roses here appear to be native roses, just judging by what they look like on their canes and the fact that their thorns are straight. It kind of cues me that she's mostly growing native roses here. This rose here is not. I can see it's still in leaf, and the buds look different, and the thorns look different than the others. I don't know exactly which rose it is, but we're going to use it as our demo here. So with roses, one important difference with the pruning on these compared to most woody ornamentals is that we are actually, to contradict myself, we are actually going to make mostly heading cuts on a rose when we prune it. And I guess I should back up for a second and explain. The roses I'm talking about today are mostly what we are familiar with, shrub, you might say shrub roses or hybrid teas. So there's many roses, everything from climbing roses to pillar roses. There's miniatures. This is one of the most bred and hybridized and beloved plants in the world. So there's many different groups of roses, but what most of us think of as roses is what I'm talking about today. So you're mostly making heading cuts on roses for an important reason. They bloom on new growth. Not all roses, some of the climbing roses actually bloom on growth that's already 1 year old or older, so you have to know that. But most of the roses that we interest ourselves with are blooming only on new growth. So in order to get the flower show that we value with roses, we need to prune each year. That pruning usually happens in February. In this climate is a good time. When I used to work in the Bay Area, we did it in late January. We used to say prune between the Rose Bowl and the Super Bowl, and we also knew exactly how many days of growth were going to happen between the pruning and Mother's Day, so that you have nice flowers on Mother's Day. But to get to the point, get back to the point, in this climate, you're usually trying to prune your roses maybe around the middle or the first half of February is good timing. Before that, if you're pruning, which tends to sometimes encourage growth, you're pruning a little bit early because you don't really want new growth to get hit by hard freezes or frost. And if you're pruning a lot later than that, then you might be missing an opportunity for the first flush of flowers. So February is good timing. When you do the pruning, you're allowing the plant to put a lot of its energy into flowering and less of its energy into vegetative or woody growth, which is what would happen if you never pruned at all. Also, you can control the height that you want it to be by pruning. And most people want to prune their cane type roses like this down to anywhere from 12 to 24 inches, but you can differ from that if you want to. If you want really tall roses, maybe you're seeing it at a distance or something like that, you can have taller canes and let it grow from that. But again, the more you prune it, the more opportunity it has putting on new growth, which is going to be covered with flowers. At the U of O campus, I noticed years ago, they seem to prune every rose, and they probably have hundreds or thousands of them on campus, down to 12 inches. I usually go a little taller, about 18 inches, but it doesn't matter greatly. So there's a whole bunch of different priorities that come in when you're pruning roses, and some of those I already spoke of with the 5 Ds, removing removing wood or canes that are dead, dying, diseased, dumb, or redundant. I guess I haven't covered the redundant yet. Maybe I'll get to that here. But what I usually do, just to simplify it when I need to work fast, is I actually start with the priority of what do I want the finishing height to be? Do I want this to be about 18 or 20 inches? So when I decide that, I usually just go in and I start cutting everything that's above that height all at once, so I can work on the plant and get all this other material out of my way, because simply said, I don't like getting stuck and getting hurt. So if I can remove this stuff now without hurting myself, then I can sort of see what we've got left here and start to work on it in a little bit more careful, methodical way. Again, prioritizing some of those 5 Ds. Let me make it so another couple cuts here. So now, if you can see it, I realize there's other roses right around it. Oh, this is part of the same one. I didn't even realize that. Let's remove that too. And finally, let's remove this one entirely. This is actually an invader from the neighbor. One of the neighboring roses is trying to take over some territory here. So let's take that out of the way, right at the bottom. Okay, and a little bit more here. Okay, so now I've got my plant down to the height that I want to finish on, and I can sort of see what I'm doing and operate a little bit more easily. I'm going to take some of this grass out of the way so you can see the plant just a little bit better. Okay, so now to apply the 5 Ds here, take this out of the way too. To apply the 5 Ds here, what I'm going to do is first remove anything that appears to be dead or dying. There's nothing here that really looks like it qualifies too badly as dead or dying. This is a pretty healthy plant. There's one cane down here that looks like it might be dead, just a tiny one. I'm going to remove that. And this one here, the same. That one appears to be dead. But what I think I would like to do is take the opportunity to remove this very old cane here, because it has plenty of other canes. You can see there's probably almost a dozen canes here. And removing this one will help renew the plant. It might encourage some new canes to come up, and that's always a good thing. So we'll take that one out. There's another dead piece. Now, I think I've removed dead, dying, and diseased. The other things we're considering are dumb and redundant. So dumb, we said, was when it's growing right through the center and not allowing air circulation, because the same as I spoke of with the blueberries, with roses, we really do want sunlight and air circulation to come inside. So I think I'm going to sacrifice a couple of these canes that are growing right through the middle. That one, maybe this one as well. and now some of these secondary branches that are growing right through the middle. Pardon me, I'm getting tangled up a little bit here with the neighboring rows. Let's see. So now we've got the center opened up a little bit better. Let's take this off. See, I'm sort of pruning things that they're growing outward, away from the center of the plant. Now we get to redundant. Redundant, I include in the 5Ds because there's not much reason to have more than one cane in the same place. These two are crossing each other and occupying basically the same space. So what I'll usually do is choose which one is better placed. This one's a little thicker looking, but this one is growing with a little more space from this other cane here. So I'll probably just remove this one because the remaining one is better placed. And most of what's remaining here I can leave. But I'll teach you one more thing about this, and that is to cut back on each cane. You want to cut back to a bud that's outward facing, because again, apical dominance. There's a tiny bud here, but it looks like it might have been damaged and turned down when I pruned it. So I'm going to find the next bud that's outward facing, and I'm going to cut just above that. Over here, I'll probably cut back to this little secondary piece and let this cane grow out in this direction. Down here, I'm going to remove some of these low ones, and I think I'll leave this one probably with this outward facing bud right there. Here, this one hopefully has an outward facing bud. No, it doesn't. This one doesn't really have any outward facing buds. It does have a little tiny node, and sometimes buds form there. So I'm going to cut back to that, which is on the outside. Again, outside facing bud. And on this one, I think we'll just leave this one and see what we get. Here's a little bit of dead material I'll remove. And on this one, there's an outward facing bud right back here. Get to this one yet? No, we'll go down to here. And I think we're done. There you have it. I hope some of that was helpful. I understand we're gonna have a question and answer on Zoom, and I'll look forward to talking to you then. Until then, happy gardening and happy holidays. Goodbye.